The radio signals arriving from the moon were impossibly weak. On the evening of July 20th, 1969, the communications reaching NASA's Mission Control in Houston originated from 250,000 miles away, transmitted by a 20-watt amplifier no more powerful than a child's walkie-talkie. Yet they carried Neil Armstrong's voice with crystalline clarity as he descended the ladder of Eagle to become the first human being to set foot on another world. Engineers at the Goddard Space Flight Center had calculated that by the time those signals crossed the void and reached Earth's atmosphere, they would disperse to 1/quintillionth of their original strength, a whisper so faint that detecting it seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. Within 90 seconds of Armstrong stepping onto the lunar surface, mission controllers in Houston possessed complete biomedical data from both astronauts, voice communications without perceptible delay, and continuous tracking information accurate to within 10 feet of Eagle's position. This wasn't magic or luck. It was the culmination of a technological infrastructure that extended across 6 continents, operated by 3,000 trained personnel, and represented an integration of global systems that the Soviet Union had never imagined possible and still couldn't fully comprehend months after Apollo 11 returned to Earth. The tracking stations receiving those signals that July evening formed a network so vast and precisely coordinated that it functioned as a single organism spanning the planet. While Americans watched Armstrong's first steps on television, transmitted through the massive 85-foot antenna at Honeysuckle Creek near Canberra, Australia, 2 other primary stations maintained simultaneous lock on Apollo 11's communications. At Goldstone in California's Mojave Desert and Frascati outside Madrid, Spain, identical dish antennas pointed toward the moon, their receivers synchronized to NASA's atomic time standard with accuracy measured in microseconds. The 3 stations were positioned at roughly 120-degree intervals around Earth's circumference, ensuring that at least one and usually 2 could maintain line-of-sight contact with the moon at any moment during its orbit. This wasn't contingency planning or redundancy for its own sake. It was the operational requirement for maintaining continuous communications with spacecraft operating beyond Earth orbit, a problem NASA had solved completely while Soviet engineers still struggled with coverage gaps lasting hours during their own lunar missions. The network that made Apollo possible hadn't existed 8 years earlier when President Kennedy committed America to landing men on the moon before the decade's end. In April of 1961, when NASA Administrator James Webb received Kennedy's directive, the agency's deep space tracking capability consisted of 3 obsolete facilities inherited from the Army. Their largest antennas measuring just 50 feet in diameter, and their electronic systems designed for the comparatively simple task of tracking unmanned probes to Venus and Mars. Webb understood immediately that monitoring humans in lunar orbit would require technological capabilities that didn't yet exist, and would need to be deployed to locations the State Department hadn't yet secured. Within 6 months he had committed $200 million, equivalent to nearly $2 billion in current values, to building what became the manned space flight network. The Soviets were spending comparable amounts on their Mid-1 rocket program during the same period, but they allocated almost nothing to ground tracking infrastructure, confident that their existing network of stations scattered across the vast territory of the Soviet Union and a few friendly nations would suffice for missions that never strayed far from their orbital paths overhead. By late 1962, NASA engineers had identified the fundamental technical challenge that would define the entire tracking system's architecture. Radio signals obey the inverse square law with merciless precision. When a spacecraft's distance from Earth doubles, the strength of its transmitted signal decreases by a factor of 4. At lunar distance, signals arriving from the Apollo command module would be 16,000 times weaker than those from spacecraft in low Earth orbit at 200 miles altitude. Standard tracking antennas couldn't capture enough of those attenuated signals to extract usable data. The solution required building receiving dishes, unlike anything that existed outside of radio astronomy, paired with electronic receivers cooled to within a few degrees of absolute zero to reduce thermal noise that would otherwise drown out the spacecraft's transmissions. NASA's engineers, working with the Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, designed a standardized 85-foot parabolic antenna that could gather radio energy from an area of nearly 6,000 square feet and focus it onto a receiver with a noise temperature of just 30 degrees Kelvin. The precision required for these systems was extraordinary. The antenna's surface had to maintain its parabolic shape to within a quarter-inch across its entire diameter, and the drive motors had to track the moon's position with accuracy measured in hundredths of a degree while compensating for Earth's rotation, atmospheric refraction, and the moon's complex orbital motion. Soviet engineers knew the Americans were building large tracking antennas, information readily available in technical journals, and NASA's own surprisingly detailed public documentation of the manned spaceflight network's development. What they consistently underestimated was the system integration that turned those individual stations into a unified tracking network. In classified assessments produced by the Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1967 and 1968, analysts acknowledged American advantages in antenna size and receiver sensitivity, but concluded these were incremental improvements over Soviet capabilities, not fundamental differences in approach. They were correct about the hardware but completely wrong about the operational concept. NASA had designed the tracking network not as a collection of individual stations that could be tasked independently, but as a distributed system where data from multiple sites would be combined in real time to eliminate coverage gaps and provide continuous tracking regardless of Earth's rotation or the Moon's position in its orbit. Every tracking station transmitted its data to Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland through a dedicated communications network separate from commercial telephone and telegraph systems. Goddard's computers, IBM 7094 mainframes programmed specifically for orbit determination, processed tracking data from all stations simultaneously and generated updated spacecraft position information every 2 seconds. That information then flowed to mission control in Houston through redundant high-speed data links with transmission delays measured in milliseconds, not minutes. The Goldstone tracking facility in California's Mojave Desert became operational in its expanded Apollo configuration in March of 1966, 3 years before the first lunar landing attempt. Located in a radio quiet zone 40 miles from the nearest town, protected from electromagnetic interference by surrounding mountains, Goldstone's 85-foot antenna could detect signals as weak as 10 to the negative 16th watts. Equivalent to detecting the radio energy from a standard light bulb at a distance equal to twice the Earth-to-Moon separation. The facility's technical director, Robert Giles, had spent 2 years solving problems that Soviet engineers never fully understood were problems at all. The antenna's supporting structure expanded and contracted several inches with temperature changes between the Mojave's searing summer days and frigid winter nights. Those dimensional changes would have destroyed the parabolic surface precision necessary for lunar communications if Giles and his team hadn't developed a system of constant measurements and automatic adjustments that compensated for thermal expansion in real time. When Apollo 11 transmitted from lunar orbit, Goldstone's receivers automatically adjusted their frequency lock 50 times per second to compensate for Doppler shift caused by the spacecraft's orbital velocity. The system worked so seamlessly that controllers in Houston saw only clean data on their screens, never aware of the continuous adjustments happening 2,000 miles away in the California desert. Honeysuckle Creek near Canberra. Australia represented NASA's most ambitious overseas facility and demonstrated the agency's success in negotiating tracking station agreements that Soviet diplomats never managed to replicate. The Australian government signed the original agreement for NASA tracking facilities on their territory in May of 1960, and by 1967 the partnership had expanded to include not just Honeysuckle Creek, but also the Tidbinbilla facility 20 miles further into the bush and several smaller stations supporting Earth orbital missions. The Australian station personnel were trained to NASA standards, operated under American technical direction during missions, but remained Australian government employees. This hybrid arrangement, repeated at stations in Spain, Guam, Bermuda and elsewhere, gave NASA a global operational footprint that would have been impossible if they'd needed to staff every facility exclusively with American personnel. The director of Honeysuckle Creek during Apollo 11, Thomas Reed, commanded a team of 97 people who had rehearsed the moonwalk communications sequence 67 times in the 3 months before the actual mission. They knew that when the moon rose over their horizon on the evening of July 21 Australian time, they would have perhaps a 20-minute window to acquire Apollo 11's signal before Goldstone took over as Earth's rotation carried the moon into view from California. That 20-minute window would include the moment Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. There could be no equipment failures, no tracking errors, no miscommunications between Canberra and Houston. Reed's team delivered flawlessly. The Madrid tracking facility at Frascati, 40 miles from the Spanish capital, completed the global triangle of primary Apollo tracking stations. NASA negotiated the agreement with Francisco Franco's government in 1964, a diplomatic achievement that raised eyebrows in Congress, but reflected the agency's pragmatic understanding that geopolitics and orbital mechanics cared nothing for each other. Spain's location on the Iberian Peninsula provided the only practical European site that could maintain communications with spacecraft traveling to or from the Moon during the portion of Earth's rotation when neither California nor Australia had line of sight. The Madrid station's technical capabilities matched Goldstone and Honeysuckle Creek exactly. NASA had standardized every component of the three primary stations to ensure that procedures, equipment, and performance were identical, regardless of which facility had primary tracking responsibility at any moment. Controllers in Houston communicated with Madrid, Canberra, and Goldstone using identical protocols and received data in identical formats. The Spanish station director, Carlos Garcia, commanded a staff of 84 that included both American NASA personnel and Spanish engineers trained in Houston. During Apollo 11, Garcia's team maintained continuous tracking of the command module Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface, providing mission control with the spacecraft's precise orbital parameters that would be essential for the rendezvous maneuver after the moonwalk concluded. That tracking data, generated by radar measurements accurate to within 30 feet at lunar distance, represented capabilities that Soviet stations wouldn't match for another 5 years. Between the three primary stations, NASA had positioned 12 additional tracking facilities forming what engineers called the secondary network. These stations operated smaller 30-foot antennas and served Earth orbital missions. But during Apollo, they provided backup communications and helped fill coverage gaps during spacecraft maneuvers. Tracking stations at Guam, Kauai, Ascension Island, Bermuda, Grand Bahama, Antigua, Corpus Christi, Merritt Island, Carnarvon in Western Australia, and 2 facilities in South Africa, created a net of receiving stations so dense that Apollo spacecraft were never out of contact with Earth for more than a few minutes, even during the most critical mission phases. Each station transmitted its data through dedicated communications circuits to Goddard, and from there to Houston. The global communications network supporting this data transmission represented yet another infrastructure achievement that Soviet planners had never attempted to replicate. NASA leased submarine telephone cables, contracted for dedicated satellite links through the recently launched Early Bird communications satellite, and in several locations built their own microwave relay towers to ensure that tracking data could flow from remote sites to Goddard without depending on commercial telecommunications networks that might be unavailable during a crisis. The total data transmission capacity of this network reached 12 million bits per second during Apollo missions, a figure that meant little to the public but represented a capability roughly equivalent to transmitting the entire Encyclopedia Britannica from Australia to Maryland in under 30 seconds. The technical specifications of the tracking network's components tell only part of the story. What made the system revolutionary was the operational concept that integrated those components into a unified whole. In Mission Control's third-floor operations room, Christopher Kraft commanded a team of flight controllers who made real-time decisions based on data flowing from tracking stations worldwide. Kraft had joined NASA in 1958 as one of the original Space Task Group members and had personally designed the mission control concept that put all decision-making authority in a single room where specialists could see the same data simultaneously and coordinate their actions through direct voice communication. During Apollo 11's descent to the lunar surface on July 20th, Kraft's controllers watched their screens as Honeysuckle Creek provided continuous tracking of Eagle's trajectory. When Guidance Officer Steve Bales noticed that Eagle's computer was taking the spacecraft toward a boulder field, he had immediate access to trajectory data showing exactly where Armstrong was steering the lunar module and how much fuel remained for maneuvering. Armstrong's decision to override the automatic landing system and fly manually to a safer location was possible only because Bales could confirm in real time that sufficient fuel existed for the extended landing. That confidence came from tracking data accurate enough to determine Eagle's altitude, velocity, and position with precision that Soviet engineers considered theoretically possible but practically unachievable at lunar distance. The Soviets had watched 3 of their unmanned lunar probes crash into the Moon in the previous 18 months, victims of guidance errors and tracking uncertainties that their ground network couldn't resolve. Soviet monitoring of Apollo 11 was extensive, methodical, and revealed capabilities that fell far short of matching NASA's tracking network. The Space Transmissions Corps, a specialized signals intelligence unit of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, operated receiving stations in Crimea, Kazakhstan, and Kamchatka that could intercept radio transmissions from American spacecraft. Colonel Alexander Kasirov commanded the Western Tracking Facility near Simferopol and had monitored every Apollo mission since Apollo 8's lunar orbit flight the previous December. His receivers could detect the Apollo spacecraft's S-band transmissions, and his team had partially decoded the telemetry format, allowing them to extract some basic spacecraft status information from intercepted signals. But Kasirov's facility couldn't track the spacecraft's position with anything approaching NASA's accuracy, couldn't decode the biomedical data streams, and couldn't receive television transmissions because Soviet engineers had never obtained the specialized scan converter equipment necessary to process the unusual format NASA used for lunar surface broadcasts. When Kasirov wrote his report on Apollo 11 monitoring in August of 1969, he noted that Soviet receivers had successfully detected communications throughout the mission, but admitted that his team's ability to interpret that data remained limited. The report acknowledged that American tracking stations were providing NASA with information that Soviet facilities couldn't match, but Kasirov attributed this to superior computer processing capabilities rather than recognizing the fundamental difference in network architecture that made NASA's global coverage possible. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, had maintained surveillance of NASA's tracking stations since their construction began in the early 1960s. Agents photographed the Goldstone facility from public roads, monitored construction at Honeysuckle Creek through embassy contacts in Canberra, and compiled detailed technical assessments of the Madrid station's capabilities based on published specifications and visual observation. These intelligence reports, declassified partially in the 1990s after the Soviet Union's collapse, reveal that Soviet analysts understood the individual technical capabilities of NASA's tracking antennas, but completely missed the significance of their global positioning and real-time data integration. A 1968 GRU assessment noted that NASA had deployed tracking stations in Australia, Spain, and California, but described this as redundancy for reliability rather than recognizing it as a deliberate strategy to ensure continuous coverage regardless of Earth's rotation. The assessment concluded that Soviet tracking capabilities were adequate for lunar missions and that the American investment in overseas facilities represented excessive caution rather than operational necessity. This fundamental misunderstanding of why NASA had built a global tracking network rather than relying on facilities within American territory reflected the Soviet space program's entire approach to the moon race. They focused on matching American achievements in rocketry and spacecraft design while underestimating the supporting infrastructure that made those achievements possible. The technical personnel operating NASA's tracking stations understood exactly what they were accomplishing, even if the public rarely considered the complexity behind those television pictures from the moon. Brian Sullivan had joined the Honeysuckle Creek team in 1967 as a junior engineer responsible for monitoring receiver performance and had advanced to shift supervisor by the time Apollo 11 launched. In interviews conducted decades later, Sullivan described the tension in Honeysuckle's control room during the hours before the moonwalk began, knowing that their station would likely be in prime position to receive the first television pictures when Armstrong opened Eagle's equipment bay to deploy the camera. Everything had to work perfectly. The 85-foot antenna was tracking the moon with precision measured in hundredths of a degree. The receivers were locked onto Apollo 11's frequency despite Doppler shift from the moon's orbital motion. The data links to Goddard and Houston were functioning flawlessly. When Armstrong pulled the D-ring that deployed the modular equipment storage assembly and activated the television camera at 9:34 p.m. Houston time, Sullivan watched his monitors as the signal strength indicator jumped, showing that Honeysuckle was receiving the transmission. The slow-scan television format produced an image that updated only once every 10 seconds, creating a ghostly, high-contrast picture that took Sullivan several seconds to recognize as Armstrong's leg and boot descending the ladder. Honeysuckle transmitted that picture to Houston and simultaneously to Australian television, giving millions of viewers their first glimpse of a human being on the moon. The image quality was marginal by terrestrial television standards, but Sullivan knew that receiving any picture at all from 250,000 miles away through equipment designed and built in less than 4 years represented an achievement that Soviet engineers couldn't replicate. At Goldstone, Robert Giles watched his station take over as primary tracking facility when Earth's rotation carried the moon out of Honeysuckle's optimal viewing angle about 20 minutes after Armstrong's first steps. The handover between stations happened seamlessly, controlled by software that monitored signal strength from all receiving sites and automatically designated whichever station had the best view as primary at any given moment. Mission controllers in Houston saw no interruption in data as tracking responsibility shifted from Australia to California. The television picture continued flowing without a break. Armstrong's voice communications maintained their clarity. Biomedical data from both astronauts updated every 2 seconds without interruption. This seamless handover, rehearsed dozens of times, but now executed flawlessly during humanity's first moonwalk, demonstrated exactly the kind of systems integration that made America's moon program possible. Giles had been working continuous shifts for 72 hours by that point, catching a few hours of sleep in the on-site dormitory between tracking passes. But he remained in Goldstone's control room throughout Armstrong and Aldrin's 2.5-hour surface excursion. He knew that if communications failed at this critical moment, if the tracking system lost lock on Apollo 11's signal, if any component of the vast network he'd helped build malfunctioned when the world was watching, the failure would overshadow every success that came before. Nothing failed, every system performed exactly as designed. The communications delay between tracking stations and mission control in Houston measured less than 1/10 of a second, fast enough that controllers experienced Apollo 11's activities essentially in real time, despite the signals traveling through undersea cables, satellite links, and microwave relays spanning thousands of miles. This minimal delay was possible only because NASA had invested heavily in dedicated communications infrastructure rather than depending on commercial networks. The agency had leased entire submarine cables for exclusive use during Apollo missions, ensuring guaranteed bandwidth and reliability that commercial circuits couldn't provide. The communications link between Honeysuckle Creek and Goddard Space Flight Center traveled through 4 separate cable systems and 3 different satellite paths simultaneously, with automatic switching equipment that would reroute the data stream if any single path failed. During Apollo 11's moonwalk, all paths functioned normally, and controllers in Houston received data from Australian tracking stations with delays so minimal that they might as well have been in the same room. Gene Kranz, the flight director who led the landing shift, made split-second decisions based on information that had been gathered on the other side of the planet milliseconds earlier. That capability, more than any single technological achievement, separated America's Apollo program from the Soviet Union's various lunar initiatives. The Soviets had rockets that could reach the moon, spacecraft that could theoretically support cosmonaut missions, and engineers who understood the technical requirements. What they lacked was the integrated global infrastructure that turned theoretical capability into operational reality. Soviet space officials publicly congratulated NASA on Apollo 11's success while privately struggling to understand how thoroughly they had been outmatched. Academician Boris Petrov, chairman of the Intercosmos Council, released a statement on July 21, praising the American achievement and noting that all mankind benefited from lunar exploration, regardless of which nation first reached the surface. Behind closed doors, Petrov met with senior officials from the Soviet space program and military intelligence to review what Apollo 11 had revealed about American capabilities. The meeting's minutes, declassified after the Soviet Union's collapse, show that participants understood they were confronting a technological gap far larger than previously assumed. The Americans had maintained continuous communications with astronauts on the moon. They had broadcast live television pictures of the moonwalk. They had provided mission controllers with real-time tracking data accurate enough to guide the lunar module to a pinpoint landing in a previously photographed location. Soviet capabilities couldn't match any of these achievements individually, much less all of them simultaneously. The meeting concluded with a recommendation that future Soviet lunar missions should focus on unmanned sample return rather than attempting to land cosmonauts. Tacit admission that the infrastructure required for human missions exceeded what Soviet resources could realistically provide. The financial investment NASA made in ground tracking infrastructure revealed priorities that reflected America's systemic advantages in the Cold War competition. Building and operating the manned spaceflight network cost approximately $300 million between 1961 and 1969, roughly 3% of the total Apollo program budget. That relatively modest percentage bought capabilities that proved essential to mission success. Soviet planners, operating under much tighter budget constraints, allocated virtually nothing to expanding their tracking network beyond what already existed for military and early space missions. The difference wasn't that Soviet leaders failed to understand tracking's importance, it was that they couldn't afford to build global infrastructure while simultaneously developing the rockets, spacecraft, and training programs needed for lunar missions. The Americans, working with a space budget that peaked at over $5 billion annually in the mid-1960s, could fund both the high-visibility achievements like the Saturn V rocket and the less glamorous infrastructure like tracking stations that made those achievements possible. This financial capacity reflected broader differences between the two economic systems. America's gross domestic product exceeded the Soviet Union's by a factor of 2 to 1 in the late 1960s, giving NASA budgetary flexibility that Soviet space planners could only imagine. The diplomatic achievements that enabled NASA's global tracking network deserve recognition alongside the technical accomplishments. Securing permission to build tracking stations on foreign territory required negotiations involving the State Department, host country governments, and in some cases local populations concerned about large American facilities in their regions. The agreement with Australia, signed in 1960 and expanded several times through the decade, gave NASA what amounted to extraterritorial rights over tracking facilities on Australian soil. American personnel could work in these facilities without standard visa restrictions. Equipment could be imported without customs delays. The facilities operated under American technical direction, even though they were staffed partly by Australian employees. Spain's agreement involved similar provisions despite the Franco government's complicated relationship with the United States. Soviet diplomats achieved nothing comparable. Their tracking stations beyond Soviet borders were limited to facilities in satellite states like East Germany and Mongolia, nations that provided territory because they had no choice rather than because they saw mutual benefit in space cooperation. The lack of global tracking coverage fundamentally limited what Soviet missions could accomplish beyond Earth orbit and reflected the political isolation that constrained Soviet space activities throughout the Cold War. The human element of Apollo 11's success extended far beyond the 3 astronauts who flew the mission. At Goldstone, Honeysuckle Creek, and Madrid, technical crews worked continuous shifts, ensuring that tracking coverage never faltered. Communications specialists at Goddard Space Flight Center monitored data links from all stations simultaneously, ready to reroute information through backup paths if primary circuits failed. Computer programmers at IBM's facility in Owego, New York maintained real-time telephone connections with mission control throughout the flight, prepared to diagnose software problems if any appeared in the tracking and orbit determination programs running on the 7094 mainframes. The Boeing technicians who maintained the Minuteman data network that NASA had leased for high-speed communications between tracking sites stood ready to bypass failed nodes if communications faltered. This infrastructure of human expertise, distributed across continents and time zones, operated with coordination that Soviet observers found difficult to believe. In classified reports analyzing Apollo 11, Soviet intelligence analysts suggested that NASA must have experienced communications problems or tracking failures that were concealed from public view, because they couldn't accept that such complex systems could function flawlessly. They were projecting their own experience with infrastructure failures onto the American program. NASA's systems worked as designed because they had been engineered with the understanding that human lives depended on their reliability and because the resources existed to test every component exhaustively before missions began. The tracking network's performance during Apollo 11's return to Earth provided a final demonstration of capabilities that Soviet observers struggled to match. On July 24, as Columbia descended through the atmosphere towards splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, NASA tracking stations provided mission controllers with continuous updates on the spacecraft's trajectory until it disappeared into the plasma blackout that occurs during the final minutes of atmospheric re-entry. Ships of the recovery fleet, positioned based on trajectory predictions calculated from tracking data gathered over the previous 8 days, were waiting within sight of Columbia's parachutes when it emerged from the clouds. The spacecraft landed less than 3 miles from the recovery carrier U.S. Hornet, close enough that helicopter crews reached the capsule within 15 minutes of splashdown. This precision was possible only because NASA's tracking network had monitored Columbia's position continuously throughout its quarter-million-mile journey to the Moon and back, accumulating orbital data so accurate that trajectory predictions improved with each passing hour. Soviet recovery operations for returning cosmonauts involved search areas hundreds of miles across, because their tracking network couldn't provide the positional accuracy necessary for precise landing predictions. This difference, like so many others revealed by Apollo 11, reflected not just a technological gap but a fundamental difference in systematic capability between the two superpowers. The legacy of NASA's tracking network extended far beyond the Apollo program. The 3 primary stations at Goldstone, Canberra, and Madrid became the foundation for the deep space network that continues supporting planetary missions today. The operational concepts developed for Apollo, particularly the integration of tracking data from multiple stations to maintain continuous contact with spacecraft, influenced every subsequent program from Space Shuttle through the International Space Station to current Mars rovers. The expertise developed in building and operating the manned spaceflight network positioned America to dominate space activities for decades after Apollo ended. Soviet space officials recognized this even as they struggled to match American achievements. In a Politburo meeting in late 1969, Minister of General Machine Building Sergei Afanasyev, whose ministry oversaw the space program, admitted that the Soviet Union lacked the economic resources and diplomatic relationships necessary to replicate NASA's global tracking infrastructure. He recommended focusing Soviet efforts on space stations in Earth orbit, where existing tracking capabilities were adequate, rather than attempting to match Apollo's lunar achievements. Decision effectively conceded the moon race and acknowledged that America's systematic advantages extended beyond any single technological achievement to encompass the entire architecture of capability that made sustained space exploration possible. The story of Apollo 11's tracking network demonstrates a truth that Cold War competitions repeatedly revealed. Individual technological achievements matter, but systematic capability matters more. Soviet engineers designed impressive rockets and spacecraft throughout the space race. They achieved genuine firsts, including the first satellite, first human in space, and first spacewalk. But they never built the supporting infrastructure that would have allowed them to sustain those achievements and extend them into more ambitious missions. The Americans approached space exploration as a system of mutually supporting capabilities where rockets, spacecraft, tracking networks, communications infrastructure, and mission control all received equal attention and resources. This systematic approach cost more and took longer to develop, but it enabled achievements that remained impossible for competitors who focused narrowly on the most visible accomplishments while neglecting supporting infrastructure. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, his words reached Earth through a network of tracking stations, communications links, and control centers that represented humanity's most complex technological achievement to that date. The Soviets intercepted those transmissions but never fully grasped how the network that carried them reflected capabilities their system couldn't match. If you've watched this far, you're exactly the kind of person who understands that victory in technological competitions goes to nations that build complete systems, not just impressive individual components. Subscribe to see more deep examinations of the Cold War's technological rivalries and the infrastructure achievements that determined which superpower would dominate the latter half of the 20th century. This channel covers the capabilities the Soviets couldn't match and often never fully understood they were competing against.